This was a war without gunfire, without battlefield explosions, yet it brought humanity to the brink of annihilation. Two superpowers stood locked in a relentless struggle. No bombs dropped, no trenches dug, but over 30,000 nuclear warheads loomed like vultures over the Earth. It was not merely a geopolitical rivalry, it was an ideological confrontation that split the world in two. The Berlin Wall rose like a scar through Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly triggered global catastrophe. For 44 long years, this conflict simmered, sometimes boiling, sometimes cooling, but never dying. How did Earth survive while standing at the edge of nuclear destruction? What kept the superpowers from lighting the fuse of Armageddon? The Cold War was born from the ashes of the Second World War. As empires fell and old powers crumbled, two nations emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union, each stronger, more confident, and more ambitious than ever before. Though allies during the war, the US and USSR were uneasy partners, bound by necessity rather than trust. When the guns fell silent in 1945, a new war began, one not of soldiers, but of ideologies. The USSR, driven by the Marxist-Leninist vision of global communism, sought to expand its sphere of influence. The United States, championing liberal democracy and free market capitalism, was determined to stop it. Each saw the other as a threat to human civilization. While the superpowers themselves avoided direct warfare, dozens of other nations bore the burden, especially in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Here, proxy wars, coups, revolutions, and regime changes became the weapons of the Cold War. And so, a war without bullets earned the name the Cold War. Even before the war had ended, tensions between the US and the USSR were rising. In 1933, the U.S. had attempted to normalize relations with the USSR, sending Ambassador William Bullitt to Moscow. The mission failed, setting a tone of distrust. The Soviets, under Joseph Stalin, began to grow more aggressive, expanding territory and strengthening the Red Army. To Washington, this was no mere defense, it was a bid for global domination. During the war, however, the US, the UK, and the USSR formed an uneasy alliance to defeat Nazi Germany. That alliance would not survive peace. In 1945, as World War II concluded, US President Harry Truman stunned the world, and Stalin, by revealing America's successful test of the atomic bomb. Just weeks later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were leveled and Japan surrendered. Stalin, already aware of the Manhattan Project via Soviet espionage, responded furiously. He condemned the bombings as inhumane and began an urgent atomic weapons program. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear bomb. The Cold War took shape as a contest between two global blocs, the capitalist West, led by the US, and the communist East, led by the USSR. At the 1945 Potsdam Conference, disputes over Poland's borders fueled hostilities. The Truman Doctrine declared America's intention to support nations resisting communism. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, an ambitious US-led effort to rebuild Western Europe and insulate it from Soviet influence. In response, the USSR launched the Molotov Plan to aid Eastern Bloc countries and shield them from capitalist contamination. Soon, the continent was split by an Iron Curtain, a political and ideological boundary that divided East and West. In Berlin, a city located in Soviet-controlled East Germany, the divisions were even more dramatic. The city was split in two. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin to starve it into submission. The United States responded with the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. It was a close call, and a warning that the Cold War would not be fought in quiet boardrooms, but in cities, jungles, deserts, and skies across the globe. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed, a military alliance pledging collective defense against Soviet aggression. To counterbalance NATO, the USSR created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, uniting Eastern European satellite states under a single command structure. Europe had become a chessboard, with each small nation a potential flashpoint. Cold War rivalries exploded into open conflict in Korea. After World War II, the Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel. North Korea became a communist state backed by the USSR and China. South Korea was supported by the United States. In 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South. A bloody 3-year war ensued. Millions died, cities were destroyed. And yet, in 1953, the war ended almost exactly where it had begun, with Korea still divided. Vietnam would be the next battlefield. In the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. became mired in a devastating guerrilla war in Southeast Asia, fighting communist North Vietnamese forces supported by the USSR and China. The war drained American morale and resources. When U.S. forces withdrew in 1975, communism had triumphed in Vietnam. In 1962, the world came closer than ever to nuclear war. The Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. When U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered the silos, President John F. Kennedy issued an ultimatum: remove the missiles or face war. For 13 harrowing days, the world held its breath. Then a deal was struck. The USSR removed the missiles. The U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. It was a moment of terrifying clarity, a warning that nuclear weapons were too dangerous for games of power. As both nations raced to build bigger arsenals, the nuclear stockpiles soared. By the 1980s, the U.S. had around 23,000 warheads. The Soviet Union had nearly 39,000. But the Cold War was not limited to Earth. It reached the stars. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It shocked the world and began the space race. In response, the U.S. poured billions into space technology. In 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon, a stunning propaganda victory for the West. The 1970s saw a temporary thaw, known as détente. The U.S. and USSR signed a series of treaties to curb the arms race. Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963, banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968, prevented the spread of nuclear weapons to new countries. SALT I and SALT II, 1972-1979, limited strategic nuclear weapons and missile systems. The Cold War reshaped the world in countless ways. Bipolar world order. Nations aligned with either the US or USSR. Proxy conflicts. Local wars became global chess matches. Resource drain. Billions were spent on weapons instead of education, healthcare, or development. UN paralysis. Global governance was often gridlocked by superpower rivalry. Military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact solidified, drawing in dozens of countries. And beyond war, the USSR aided decolonization movements across Africa and Asia, hoping to build a world order free from Western imperialism. By the 1980s, the Cold War had become unsustainable. The Soviet economy stagnated, military costs soared. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, introducing reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. By 1989, Eastern European countries began toppling their communist regimes. The Berlin Wall fell, Germany reunited, and in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a collapse. But its legacy lives on, in alliances, in political divisions, in nuclear arsenals, and in cautionary tales. This was the war that could have ended humanity. Yet, through diplomacy, deterrence, and a measure of restraint, the world survived. Let us remember it not just as a historical conflict, but as a reminder. Peace is fragile. Ideologies can divide, but the future is ours to shape together.